Okay, so these are the nerfs. We have 3 rogue nerfs and 1 neutral nerf, but this is essentially just a mostly control warrior, but just kind of general control-ish nerf. You can still run Lysiana in the same way that you could before. It's just you can't really bounce her like you did with the 8 mana cost. But as far as Lysiana, she's still playable. But let's talk about this stuff. So, Evil Miscreant being at 4 health versus being at 5 health isn't really that big of a deal. As far as, like, is the card still good? Yes, the card is still insane. But it loses more to zoo matchups, and it dies more efficiently to removal. So if you're trying to deny the bounce, it's a lot easier, which I think is important. But the deck using Evil Miscreant, whichever that will be, is still incredibly strong because the lackeys are just so dang good. Raiding Party, probably along the side of unplayable in conjunction with the Preparation nerf, because playing 2 mana to draw 2, maybe 3. Well, no. 2 mana draw 3 is not really good enough for 2 cards, I would say. It's not good enough tempo for Rogue, that is. I think you'll be seeing Raiding Party get subbed out for Fan a lot more, just to get the early game minions dealt with and whatnot. It just seems like the most logical kind of change. And I think you'll also see, if you do run the pirate package, that Hook Tusk gets run a lot more, because you don't have to worry about battling with your raiding party results, and Hook Tusk is just a really good card in general. Preparation being the 2 mana instead of the 3 mana discount means that Prep Fan is not a thing anymore, which is a pretty big deal. Well, it is a thing, but it's only a thing at 1 mana. So you would still have to have some kind of cost with that. But as far as like low cost prep, like Prep Sap and Prep Eviscerate, and like Prep Sinister Strike with like Malagos combos, that stuff still exists. This is more about the expensive spells getting prepped down, which was causing too much trouble. So I would say this is more of a big deal when it comes to specifically the draw engine of Rogue, when it's not Gadgets and Auctioneer, like Sprint and Raiding Party, of course, which is nerfed, as well as Fan. But it's also kind of a pretty big nerf for Vanish, because one of the big upsides with Vanish is that you can nerf it down to 3, but because you can no longer do that, it's just a really slow, unimpactful AoE clear. So you have to have a lot more of a consistent and competitive deck in order to run Prep and Vanish in the same slot, I think. It doesn't necessarily make that combo unplayable, but it does make it significantly worse. Okay. I think that is all for me at the moment. At least for these right now. I guess, just to speak of Lysiana, they'll still run it. It's too good not to run as the 1-off. You'll just drop the Panda is all. And outside of dropping the Panda, I don't see any reason why you'd actually cut this card. It's just really good in any control deck that's meaning to tech against a control matchup. Maybe if the meta is like really aggro, you won't run this, like kind of like how I first reviewed the card. If the meta is much more aggro, you don't need to run this, but if the meta is super control, then you need to run this. So yeah, this is potentially not going to see play, but only dependent on the meta. So in addition to having everything get its balance updated, we're getting a new card, Sn1p-Sn4p. And Sn1p-Sn4p is a 3-mana Magnetic Echo neutral mech with Death Rattle summon 2 Macrobots. But really the big thing that matters here is the Echo. Echo and Magnetic is insane. And the fact that it comes bundled together with no like setup required is also insane. There's a Priest combo that's been like discussed to death already, and that you have this and the 5-mana guy that discounts your Death Rattles by 3, and you just magnetize over and over again to literally any mech for infinite damage, and then you win. So yeah, that's a big deal. And I would imagine that priests will probably be running mechs now because that's just way too good to not do. So get your taunt minions, I guess, because that's pretty busted. Other than that, though, Death Rattle Hunter obviously likes this. Even Control Warrior might like this, depending on how good the body ends up being. It is essentially a 3-mana 4/5, so it's really well statted for its cost. It's just like an insanely good card. You might even run this outside of just like actual mech decks, like kind of like Ziliax is, just because the stats are just so good. So yeah, it's a really good card. It's going to see a lot of play if it doesn't get nerfed, which I think it will. Okay, speaking of nerfs, here are some buffs. So we've got Gloop Sprayer from 7 mana now instead of 8. As far as that nerf goes, oh, gotta call. It isn't a nerf, it's a buff. Gotta get this through my head. As far as that buff goes, obviously it's good because reducing costs of stuff is good. I just don't think Druid is really in a place where it can really run this kind of card to a good effect. Maybe if there are actual ramp tools in Druid again, this will be better. But at the time being, Ramp Druid is just so bad along with Control Druid that it's going to really take some help to actually get this anywhere. Like, the loss of Naturalize was just such a big deal to Control Druid because now it has to run BGH to kill big threats. And that is a 4-mana difference between removing something big, which is a big problem. So, yeah. Druid not in a good spot right now for control. But maybe one day. Mulch Muncher, I think, is kind of the same vein. I think it's too cute to run in Token Druid, even with all the Treant builds that are in there. I think I'd much rather run the Transformative Treant Synergy, the one that changes your Treants into 5/5s. That one's a lot better for that kind of build. So I think Muncher, maybe some experimentation, maybe a 1-of. I could see a 1-of if you're feeling interesting. But it would have to be really dependent on trying to counter a mid-range deck, which is an interesting kind of meta to be in. I don't think we're going to go there, but we'll have to see. We have Hunter getting Necromechanic to 4 mana down from 5, so a 4 mana 3/6 with your Death Rattle trigger twice. That is really good because Water Elemental as like the standard 4-drop for some mid-range decks for Mage was always like a very strong card. So if this card ever finds a good deck to like house itself in, then it's gonna like really boost the power of that deck. I'm thinking offhand, the Mech Hunter just really likes this, just because the Death Rattle curve is just kind of nice of doing Bear and then playing this to draw 2 cards is really good. In addition to that, there are some other pretty strong Death Rattles inside Mech Hunter that you wouldn't have to really spend too much to include this for. Like the bombs, for one. The bombs dealing 4 damage apiece is pretty stupid. You can also combo this with Mossy Horror now at 10 mana once you've done Flex Boomzooka the turn before. So you can do a... With setup for 10 mana, you can do 4 times 4, so 16 damage. That's pretty good. 16 damage burst is not bad. But in addition to that, there's like Spider Bomb... And there's like the Mecharoo. There's like little granular stuff that you can do with that card. And the cost is not high. So I think it's a great card now. And we'll definitely see some experimentation when it comes out. Flex Boomzooka is still trash and will always remain trash until it's like, if they tried to buff it again, I'd say like 6 mana would probably be like maybe playable status. Actually, that'd be definitely playable. You could put that in a mid-range and not feel too bad. But yeah. It's like 7 mana, draw 3, deal 5 damage, basically, in like a mid-range deck. And if you're using this for some kind of combo to like resurrect, I guess there is still the res card, but I still think 7 mana is probably too expensive to do something like that. So if it were 6 mana, maybe, but 7 mana, it's not really any distinctively different than it was before, I feel. I'm just going to stay as is. Unexpected results. This card's a really good buff. Like, it was already like pretty passable at 4, but at 3, it's like kind of like borderline like kind of broken status. Like as far as like a comparison, you can think of it like the Spirit Wolves, except there's no overload. So yeah, it's super busted when it comes to just any kind of mid-range or any kind of tempo mage. And it scales even higher if you can somehow manage to get spell damage on 2, to where you would then play your spell damage minion on 2 and then play this and then get 2 3-drops for 3 mana. It's like ridiculous amounts of tempo. So it's just really good. I don't know. The only issue is like actually getting a spell damage minion on 2 sometimes, because there's like the 0-6 they printed, but that's a 0-6, so I can't really say you're getting tempo out of that. There have to be a lot of experimentation about. At the very least, it's better baseline now that you can just play it and be okay, where you don't even have to put in spell damage at all into the deck and just run it in tempo, and that's good. So it's a good card now, like straight up. Pocket Galaxy, it's way better now because the cost of actually playing the card is nowhere near as expensive. You don't pass the turn nearly as much, and you can expend the costs earlier on, so you don't have to give your opponent a higher mana swing. So I think this is more beneficial in terms of going up against control and mid-range than anything else. So I think it does help as far as like buffing the deck up. I don't think the deck is currently better than the current giant mage, hand mage, whatever you want to call it. I think the tempo that deck gets for so cheap is just way too good to pass up on. So I think this is like maybe second in command, potentially, depending on how easy it is to make a deck that can take advantage of this. I imagine it's not too hard though. You could just make any kind of control-ish mage in the same kind of vein as hand mage. You could even maybe play this in hand mage if you're feeling like you don't mind the discard, but I feel like that's too risky. So you probably want a different deck. Maybe something with like the Sorcerer's Apprentices and the Archmage Antonises at 1 mana and whatnot. But definitely way better at 5 than 7. Definitely playable. We have Crystology at 1 mana. It was already insane at 2 mana. It's completely insane at 1 mana. So I don't know why they decided to buff this card. But yeah, that card is really, really good. So it's going to definitely see some play now, if it wasn't already. 1 mana, draw 2. Oh, baby. That's good. 5 mana, 3/4. Give your minions in your hand +2/+2. I've been seeing Kibler use this in mech decks, so I think it can definitely work better there. It was already pretty dang good, honestly. So being able to do this a turn earlier makes that deck much stronger, so it can get those mech tempo turns much more consistently in the early game. So I think that's actually kind of a really big buff for mech Paladin in general. But like just base hand buff Paladin, still not good. You need to have the mechs. We have extra arms. Priests have been playing this as like kind of experimental and some kind of like silence and like tempo priest builds. So the fact that it's 2 mana of 2/2 as like almost like a charge option kind of gives it the same vein as the marks for Druid. If you could make a reasonable mid-range priest with this card, I think it would see some play. It's competing with some ridiculous mid-range decks right now. Like, Zoo is still going to run priest over a lot of the time just because of how wide the boards are and how quickly they gain lethal. If it were an inner fire build, maybe you could compete with that, but it would take a lot of testing. I think maybe some kind of like pyro inner fire circle of healing kind of build would be able to do it. So that seems like the most optimal way to go about it for me. Cloning Device at 1 mana. It's still not good. It's a better cantrip now, but you would still never play it over the 0 mana ones. And there's enough 0 mana cantrips in Priest right now that this doesn't need to see play. So this just won't see play ever. Pogo Hopper at 1 mana down from 2. I don't think this substantially changes the power level of Pogo Hopper because the setup is still really slow. It makes it more spammable in the late game so that you can overwhelm your opponent with more as you go all in. The problem with that is most control decks tend to do a mass AoE like Brawl or like Twisty Nether in the late game. So if you get to that point and you invest everything, then you will end up losing all of your Poké Hoppers to just one card, which would be really bad. But in the instances where you have exhausted your opponent's resources and you just need to push, this is really good because it can allow you to push for more stats in one turn. So that's the general buff of this card. It's also not as high of a cost to run against aggro because you can just play it as a 1-mana 1/1 in the beginning. So it makes it a little bit better against aggro, but you still need to get the Ziliax trigger onto this card to heal yourself. So it still takes a while to actually catch up with this deck. But it does at least help in that vein. Violet Haze is still trash and will always remain trash as long as the cards are as inconsistent as they are. It just puts it in the same vein as the Mage card that gives you 2 completely random minions. But yeah, this is not good, so you still won't run it. Stormbringer at 6 is actually pretty scary. If you think about some of the Shaman token builds, most of their boards are pretty wide by turn 5 because of the Bloodlust scenario. So having another turn after that being the random legendary scenario is pretty scary. The only thing is like the entire dynamic of the matchup doesn't actually change. It just changes how much the high roll can be. And the one good thing about Stormbringer is you can do it on a lower impact board of like maybe 2 or 3 minions instead of your Bloodlust and gain adequate value out of it a lot of the time. So you can invest this in order to then widen your board later. The only issue with it is that is a high variance strategy, so I don't know if you would really want to run it that way. But as far as the card itself, mana discounts are always good, so it might see a bit more experimentation in token builds. I don't think you would ever run this in control. You would probably experiment with this in mid-range, but mid-range Shaman doesn't really exist right now outside of the Thunderhead builds. And speaking of Thunderhead's really good now. It's for 3/6 for 4 mana. It was already really good at freaking 3/5, so yeah, that's a scary buff. And I think it's going to see some decent experimentation, probably more so against decks that are swarming the board a lot. So if like mid-range Hunter comes back, or if Zooey comes back, this will see a lot of use. But outside of that, it's just really well statted, so it's just no cost to playing this card in any deck. I guess no cost unless you can find something that has a better effect, because the effect itself is kind of restricted in that the overload cards have to be used, and really the only overload cards that Shaman uses when running this card that I can think of are the removal spells, Lightning Storm, and the Voltaic Burst guy, yeah. Those are like the main 3, but even so, it's still like the 1 health buff is not to be underestimated. It makes it so hard to kill. So yeah, it's a great card now. Spirit Bomb, this card's still bad even at 1 mana. Like in aggressive decks, you would always run Soulfire, and in control decks, you're okay most of the time playing Shadow Bolt instead of this. So the only instances where this would actually be good is if you wanted to damage yourself for cheap, and there are Flame Imps for that. So yeah, I'm not seeing it right now. Maybe in an instance where you can really afford to lose the health, but in an aggressive meta, this just isn't passable in the same vein as like, I don't know, like Mortal Coil. I would definitely run Mortal Coil for that, because like the thing about aggressive decks is that their minions are always like usually around like 2 health. So if you manage to even do 1 damage, Mortal Coil is just a strictly better card that can then cycle you into your AoE, whereas this card is just a card that almost detrimental to your strategy of trying to survive because of the 4 damage. It's like if you kill 1/1 with this card, it's like the 1/1 accelerated 4 turns and hit in the face 4 times. So it's like as if you gave your opponent more tempo by removing their minion, which is just bad. So I don't think this is going to see play. Dr. Morgan, it's definitely way better at 6, but I do think even as a 6 mana 5/5 recycle, it's going to have to be in some kind of mid-range to control. And I think control Warlock is not interested in running this simply because it will typically run Jiraxis or Rafam. So because it runs those cards, it probably won't run this. And because this will cycle out before either of those cards do, it's going to need some kind of other scenario into which this will actually see some kind of play. So I'm thinking a pass on this one right now. But if something ever gets printed to buff it, sure. Security Rover as a 2/6 instead of a 2/5. This is no change basically. It's still really slow. The health makes it more usable as far as like you get the triggers more, but the fact that it comes at 6 and it doesn't have taunt in its own makes it so that you basically die the turn you play this against like a couple of mid-range decks get to play it, and then you attack with it, and then you get a taunt, and then they kill the taunt, and then they kill you. So it's like, it doesn't actually do anything. But if you could give it taunt, if they just give it taunt, it'll be good. Yeah. So, yeah. But the other scenario that we have to think of this is, in Control Warrior, when you will be Dr. Boom most of the time, this having Rush and the extra health means that it will be a lot more annoying to deal with in that scenario. So in the cases where you will make this, it is way better. But in the cases where you play this, it's still strictly bad. So you just want to get this from random effect. Same thing kind of goes for Nullifier. It would be great if it had taunt, but it does not have taunt, therefore it is still bad. But if you get this from a random effect, it's better now because it has 4 attack instead of 3. Makes the random effects from Dr. Boom better than they already are. But outside of that, that's really all I see from those. So overall, I think the biggest winners from these buffs, I'm going to have to say, I think it's Paladin, honestly. Because Crystology was already really good, and now Crystology is 1 mana. I think of like the Control Paladin starts now, where you didn't have anything to do on turn 1, because they rotated out your 1 mana, 1/1 Divine Shield taunt thing. But now you have like draw 2 cards for 1 mana, and then you do that into Dude instead. That's like really good. So as far as like consistency in Paladin goes, that's like a huge boon, and it's going to be really helpful for mid-range and Control Paladin builds. I think second place is probably somewhere along the lines of Necromechanic being good. Probably Pocket Galaxy just overall. Extra Arms potential, and Thunderhead. Those are like the ones that I'm looking at. I'm like, yeah, that might do something. But definitely Crystology. That's ridiculous. All right. And this card is still broken. I think they might hotfix this when it gets printed, just because it is so aggressively statted and so abusable in Priest. I wouldn't be surprised if they let it sit for a little while, but it's just so good at 3. They have to put it to 4. It just makes sense.